Hello everyone, today we talk about the Translatio Regni Francorum ad Saxones, a topic which we have definitely dealt with in the videos about the Renovatio Imperii tout court, but that we never observed from properly the year-to-year history of the Ottonian dynasty. Today we will be talking about the reign of Henry the Fowler and the broader, concept of power that exudes from this specific context that we somehow define already as Teutonic in many ways, but that was also very much in theory regarding that sort of composition of what would become, in fact, in a unitary and in a national sense, the Teutonic kingdom. Of course, the Eastern Frankish one already existed, but as you know, the awareness of these Germanic lands, like gradually conglomerating to one polity, essentially also separated from the rest of the Germanic world as a thing on its own, and connected, of course, later through the same Ottonians to the empire, and so rising to this higher international role, is something that was really made at this point and not previously existing in the way we bacteriologically intend. We have to deal with our limits as well, because historiographically we get such references. For example, in the Annales Juvavensibus, or better, from some excerpts that we have from these annals of Salzburg, dating to the mid-10th century, we can read how the Bavarians appointed Duke Arnulf of the Liudolfing dynasty as king, not in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, as we sort of more clearly understand from the sources of the time, but as king in the kingdom of the Teutons. Right? Remember, this guy was elected in 907, so there is an ongoing debate concerning the actual veridicity of this statement, because not only we know that this work was composed almost half a century later, a couple of generations later, from the election, and in quite a year in which the Ottonians had already affirmed themselves in that more sort of monarchic sense all over the entire Eastern Frankish kingdom, and this Bavarian duke had control just so far, as we will see now, of the same. But it's possible that the now lost original version of the same Annales of Juvavum of Salzburg definitely did have a precocious sense of the primacy, the pastoral primacy in Germany, and connected with the local archdiocese, etc. At some point we will make a video about the ecclesiastical principality of Salzburg. May have actually been missing, and that this indication of a Teutonic kingdom or identity, so allegedly and reportedly by the beginning of the 10th century, would have actually figured only later, right? As in the mid-12th century we have the earliest manuscript, so being a copy of the original, also copied as an exercise by novice scribes, as it was the case, actually in a time in which the concept of a kingdom of the Germans, or a German kingdom, we are essentially at the time of the rise of the Hohenstaufen, had become commonplace and was not really challenged anymore. That was actually the peak of a German national monarchy that eventually will shipwreck, differently from England or France. But indeed, the concept of a Teutonic nation of sort was already there. The same foreigners recognized this. This is in the age of Crusades. There is also a more broader characterization of the various European nations. By the time of Arnulf of Bavaria, and the same one, in fact, in which Henry the Fowler assumed kingship of the same Eastern Frankish kingdom, there wasn't likely this kind of awareness, right? The idea of a Teutonic nation was being fostered in those very years, and surely by actors that would have liked to emphasize like the importance of a monarchic rule. But who were these? Like mostly in monasteries of, I don't know, Reichenau, of Fulda, of St. Gallen, and it was just something gradually developing. You can argue that yes, it's likely that in the 10th century this thing was already set some sort of logical premise, given the 9th century partition that the Carolingians had made, like this Eastern Frankish kingdom as a thing on its own, and so there would have to be another name, especially now that essentially the empire had collapsed in its political unity. So to recognize these, nobody really called the Germans Teutonics at that point. In fact, it's a classicism, right? It really stems from the actual etymology of Deutschland, of the Deutschen, right? That, however, for the highly literate ecclesiastical elite, could easily be a classical borrowing from the times, in fact, of the Cimbri and the Teutonists, that, as you know, were not even technically coming from lands that were at this point, in fact, part of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, rather the Jutland, but that's another story. So when we read from these excerpts of the older Annales of Juvavum / Salzburg, we are likely witnessing either later correction or addition to the original text, because by the 12th century, again, people could look back at the times and reasoning through their own lens, saying, okay, well, that was still what essentially became, more or less from that point, the kingdom of the Teutons. This is important. We will, of course, keep talking different occasions about the sense of identity. For example, if you're interested in that same sort of mid-12th century perspective, I made a video about the Holy Roman Empire. I think if you search for Holy Roman Empire, probably in the title of the video, identity, something like that, I don't remember exactly what it was, you will find it. Ideology, yes, it was that thing. Stressing how by that point, being German, being a Roman in a sense, and in fact this stemming properly from the Ottonian times, we discussed this in other videos about the Ottonians, and all one with the empire had elevated the same German nation to that, in fact, level of necessary compactness that the international scene required. Of course, the history of the early stem duchies and the previous populations that, in fact, were also something different even from these. You know, the stem duchies emerge but in a time in which, of course, the elites have already very much internationalized in these places. And so they actually stress their own ethnic identity mostly to maintain their own autonomy, very often against, in fact, a monarchic power concentration, but always being very eager otherwise to internationalize and universalize further once they were the actual guys rising to the royal throne. This is again the case for the Ottonians, right? But Germany was really just a very big but also very composite and divided country at the time. There were these massive forests that had in great part, in fact, separated the various stem duchies as different endemic pools. So aside from this, unfortunately, we will not talk about this today. You know that gradually we cover everything, right? But we must pass through this 10th century to also disentangle, I don't know how to say, unentangle in English, this broader concept of how the thing was coming to be. It's interesting because, when you see this more unitary national overlapping compared to the contemporary nations, more or less, right, from this early time, which was surely a thing, you tend to sort of simplify the picture and equally disregard the actual effort and achievement that this compaction really was, right? Because from one side, people are very nationalistic, they want to stress the unity of the system and how powerful it already was and effective and whatever, projecting, in fact, a capacity that did not quite exist at the time for a reason that is not sabotaging that same national capacity. On the contrary, was exactly coming to be because it was surpassing these petty divisions. From the other side, those sort of more provincialist, federalist observers would like to stress that at the end of the day, these were sort of different provinces that always remained more or less on their own, and especially in Germany, the federal nature of power always sort of distinguished them in a hopelessly fundamental way, right? Naturally, reality lays in between, together with the truth. But the process by which this came to agglutinate is sort of highlighting, if anything, just also in the latter perspective, instead the efforts of rulers like the Teutonic that understood the necessity of unity, just what is always there in terms of political compaction. It doesn't matter how the institutions really work, but the actual power that you display because you receive the support of the people. Today we will not talk excessively how that also happened. That's also for another video, but it's just for framing ever more precisely today's topic, right? Consider, as I said at the beginning, we have limits to understand even how it really was at the time. What do we really mean by Teutonicy? Even in given for granted that Salzburg manuscript in the mid-10th century refer to them for these very authors, right? The most straightforward answer is that it certainly did not exactly refer to a single Germanic people neatly encompassing the Franks, the Suabians, the Bavarians, the Thuringians, and the Saxons. We mention Arnulf of Bavaria because he was contemporary, as we'll see better now, to Henry the Fowler, and in a quite different, almost antithetic position, even though Germany was sort of a multi-centric country on this very basis, and barely a country as we intended, as we were just pointing out. There would always be, throughout all the Middle Ages and up to this day, like an important divide between northern and southern Germans that really live, feel, and think in very, very different ways. And so it was at the time. I mean, the Saxons of Henry the Fowler were the descendants for just a few generations of those brutal, primitive, and more sort of hardcore Germans that sort of better embodied in, spirit the same ones fighting at Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, right, that had been in a traumatically, as shockingly and equally brutal fashion, crushed, massacred, deported by Charlemagne back in the day. In fact, a great embarrassment of the Ottonian dynasty, they didn't really have any Carolingian ancestry up to a certain point. They just could boast Widukin's one, that, however, was still a positive figure because he fought, but also survived in the wars against the Carolingians. As a leader, was respected for his nobility and then ended up being baptized and so on. That otherwise, the patrilinear ancestry of the Ottonians is some obscure Carolingian count placed in Saxony somewhere. Whereas, instead, Arnulf, from places like Bavaria, was of course incarnating that more advanced Romanized, civilized, economically developed part of the country, that if it did not really incarnate the grandeur of the Frankish legacy that was more in the West, like mostly around places like Cologne, or the confluence between the Main and the Rhine, really carried another vibe, right? It had a Celto-Roman past. It was a country of early Catholicism, of ancient ties with Italy, with a sort of easier and to some extent even more influent approach towards the eastern frontier with the Slavs, the Pannonian Plain. I made a video, if anything, about the Lido-German that explains a bit this, because there, as you know, Regensburg was the actual capital, and so like a much more refined place, and still today Bavaria, as you know, particularly rich, to say the least, in Germany. Like the north is still somehow different. You can argue, of course, that this divides were incredibly felt. Right, Saxony was more exposed to the Vikings. Also, the Slavs on the Elbe were sort of more ruthlessly primitive and aggressive than even the sort of the better organized ones towards like the upper part of the valley. We talked about this all, like the same Ottonian expeditions against the Slavs that today we will recur, but I made very sort of in-depth military historical videos on that, the development of Bohemia, of Moravia for the regional series. Like also recently I discussed the Principality of Nitra, the obvious evangelical role that Salzburg had towards those Western Slavs, right? So different languages of power, right? Different senses of wealth, of nobility, even, and ancestry as well. It's thus all the more relevant that it was Saxony, by the way, to take over the entire system. Of course, the Ottonian rule over the Eastern Frankish kingdom, even at the peak of the imperial power of the Saxon house, was imperfect and very decentralized, and the same empire could be achieved exactly because there was a general consensus to give it with like the decisive moral majority to this dynasty to also reconnect with the Italic kingdom, to make a broader stance, like internationally speaking, putting an end to the Magyar raids that had been largely fueled by the same Eastern Franks in their fights between one another. In fact, the Saxons had to fight for repressing here and there various revolts of the same Germans that at some point were not interested in that kind of overrule, right? So when you look at Arnold's power, you equally acknowledge how this barely extended beyond Bavaria, if it ever did, because there is no even evidence about this explicitly. And so we could see the latter's rule, regardless of what the likely later edition of the Annals of Salzburg says, more a revival of Bavarian kingship, like during, say, the Merovingian part of the Carolingian times, right, that had also been reactivated in the crisis of the same empire, practiced, for example, by Carloman from 876 to 879. As we will see today, there were lots of different pretendants to all these various lands, and again, these elites were very international because the Carolingian legacy is extremely powerful in that dynastic direction. This is an aspect that we should never forget about post-Carolingian times. But it was also obvious that the local power of these noblemen was heavily tied to the local, to the provincial establishment that once gained, immediately attracted sort of envy, antipathy, and even aggression from their neighbors, so that it was difficult to simply surpass at this point of the second invasions, like the Iron Centuries, moment of significant political fragmentation and reorganization of the system, to simply, like, again, step behind and surpass it in an imperial fashion. That's, again, why the Ottonian enterprise is even more valuable. The same Arnulf of Bavaria essentially followed in Carloman's footsteps when, in 934, he intervened in Italy. Remember, this is the year after Riade, so when Henry the Fowler was at the peak of his power, and so this was an attempt still to think provincially in a sense and to secure the Italic crown for Arnulf's son Eberhard. And you know that this is still a phase. I mean, it's not before the 50s that the Ottonians themselves come to Italy, and so up to that point, still the attempt to reunite these various lands comes with the competition, the attrition, and the clash between these various provincial powers in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, in the Italic one, and so there is no overlord. Even when, like in this case, the actual kingship of, say, the Eastern Frankish kingdom, or even, hopefully, like the imperial title, as was the case for, I don't know, the rulers of Spoleto or Friuli, etc., was claimed. We'll have to talk way more about the first half of the 10th century, because it's one of the single most crucial, important times in the entire history of mankind. Nevertheless, the Frankish and Saxon electors of the Duke of Saxony, so Henry, originated from the sub-kingdom assigned to Louis the Younger in 876. Consider this aspect. Like the Carolingian legacy, Louis in particular was the second eldest son of the three sons of Louis the German and Emma. So again, watch the video about Louis the German if you're interested. And he succeeded his father as the king of Eastern Francia on August the 28th, 876, and succeeded his elder brother Carloman as king of Bavaria, that we talked about before, from 879 to 882. Right, so he died eventually, in fact, in 882, as he was succeeded in all his territories, which included, at that point, most of East Francia. Realized that at this point, like, the Carolingian Empire technically still exists in a unitary sense, or at least, say, in a partial way, but still intended potentially as one that could be reunited as Charles III, Charles the Fat, does. But in fact, his younger brother, Charles, who was already the king of Italy and emperor. I made a video about Rome in the age of Charles III. It's not like he was particularly like of an Italian ruler. He ruled from north of the Alps, but he had secured this title, and in fact is counted as Charles III emperor. And there you can appreciate all the factions there, the Eastern Frankish one, the Western Frankish one in Rome, how also the Roman nobility was playing with that, and the same Carolingian legacy in the kingdom of Italy. Consider this aspect, that Henry the Fowler himself was born into the Carolingian Empire, right? So he was really like of a generation that still conceived the fact that were the children, the grandchildren of Charlemagne himself ruling this potentially world system, right? It's as if we separated the thing in a catastrophistic way. The 9th century is at the beginning, the peak of the Carolingian Empire. At the end of it, the system sort of crumbles, and so the 10th century is just pure fragmentation. Nobody talked to one another. There is no empire whatsoever. No, we explained how in different times of this apparent collapse, both the Roman one, the Carolingian one, like, it's not like the system simply said, okay, we're out of it. Finally, this thing ended. Nobody reasoned like that. Nobody, right? Just lesser people in the 21st century threatened by power and Catholic standards really do. These people knew, of course, that the only divine reward is world domination, if they're up to that same godlike standard. So you see, of course, Henry aiming to expand his influence from the very beginning of his rule. Right? Immediately after his election in Fritzlar, he took military action against powerful contendent Burkhard of Swabia, who subsequently submitted. Now this game, as you understand, is crucial because, first of all, it shows that there is like a veritably national scale of political and military action in the Eastern Frankish kingdom that is, in fact, enucleating ever more as itself, right? Which is new, because, again, up to this point, it had been almost like always like the Franks from the west that had done something in this reign, and again, even the same Carolingians who had ruled in the Eastern Frankish kingdom sort of barely ever went to the north, right? They were interested in regaining the western part of the empire. They mostly operated in Bavaria, also in Swabia, depending on what we're doing in Franconia. But at this point, you start seeing a dynamic that will ultimately reinforce the same Eastern Frankish system in that elective direction that we know fundamentally will always remain at the basis of the system, regardless of the ups and downs of the royal state, let's say. And there is another aspect here, is that, of course, the nature of power in Eastern Francia is sort of way more primal and traditional in a warlike and sacred sense than, let's say, at least like in a sacred sense, not as much as in the West, in the way it had probably been already sanctioned since Merovingian times, with the support of sort of a much more robust elite. And in fact, the military manpower of Europe, the powerhouse of Europe, will remain in the West. Even when the Holy Roman Empire was established, let's say Germany reaches the peak of power in the second half of the 12th century, properly as a German power, right? Then throughout all this time, essentially, even when France is fragmented, still in absolute terms, like it's actually fragmented because of the power that exists there so much that it's not just about all these various princes that are equally powerful as kings, but this would also glue it together much more than in Germany, because in Germany there was less surplus, less stratification, hence all these issues with these various stem duchies and the ultimate result of the elective monarchy. But even that, right, even that corresponded to this older idea that you had to test your capacity as a military leader to be restlessly, trying to keep together the system that, as a whole, was really immense, because Germany is expanding towards the east and must do it if it wants to also survive and being competitive from enemies on the other side that at some point will threaten to destabilize the same Saxony, Thuringia, and Bavaria throughout the 10th century, especially the first half. And so it's an incredibly brutal contest. The Swabians, the Alemanni, we've seen them, were historically like sort of beaten by the Franks. They had definitely a Franco-Alemannic elite. I just made a video about medieval Switzerland, sort of pre-Swiss era, strictly meant. And so many other videos about the Alemanni. And in this fragmentation of the empire, they had sort of come back with this sort of more also warlike and primitive bias that had characterized it. The Alemanni had fully Christianized only later in time, and they eventually would maintain the sense of grandeur, gradually won, like absorbed, subsumed from the Franconians into the same Hohenstaufen dynasty that makes Swabia the most glorious land in German history. Sort of a more median land that could sort of in between, in fact, the German north, the Baltic, and Mediterranean, Rome, etc. So they're also mythologically quite sort of metaphysical location. In any case, at this point, of course, the Saxons are starting to channel their primitively brutal forces into the more refined and sophisticated Carolingian war machine. So Henry the Fowler is definitely the guy who, develops, as we'll see now better, his vassalitic clienterly relations. He develops the agrarian milites, the sort of this backbone of the Saxon aristocracy, essentially fully and completely replicating that Frankish mentality of essentially waging war every single season, and so creating a hell of a professional elite force, right, in the upper echelon of the system. Is also pretty much squeezed, because again, making war in Saxony was sort of more difficult perspective than in Swabia or in Bavaria, in interest of availability of resources, right? But these guys have been, again, totally traumatized in the previous century. They have developed this particularly restless as effective combination of bloody human sacrificial memories and will, and sort of an evangelical sort of fact equally crushing and Christianizing missionary mindset that is all one with the grandeur of the empire, the unity of the empire, the preservation of this whole perfect universe that now is in the palm of their hand, or at least they are inspiring for it to become. Burkhard of Swabia is submitted. Naturally, it's not like Saxony could simply submit Swabia. So what this actually gets down to is Henry concluding a friendship pact with him. Right? He proved to be the better man, the stronger leader, the one that God had given the Holy Ghost to in order to gain this victory. The best way this can end is, of course, not through extermination, destruction, whatever, but it's saying, okay, now join us, right? To the extent you can and you're able to tolerate. Let's augment forces, because together we can crush the others and actually turn this defeat into some redemption for you, which is also very, again, traditional and Roman, imperial, Catholic way of thinking, unsurprisingly. After all, Henry had already established an agreement with Eberhard of Franconia. Franconia representing the grandeur of the Franks. In many ways, it was a very, again, commercial, well infrastructurally served area, contrasting with, again, the primitivity of Saxony, but in fact blending beautifully into it. In fact, the Ottonian dynasty, as you know, fundamentally rules from Saxony and Franconia historically. These other stem duchies are sort of a bit more on their own, because there is a leaning, at least attentively, towards Western France as well, because those were the richest areas, but also the toughest ones, and we've seen a bit of Western Frankish and Lotharingian warfare waged by the Ottonians that is settling a bit that frontier between roughly what would become France and Germany. The new Saxon king accepted Burkhard of Swabia's submission, while simultaneously affirming the sub-regal position of the Swabian duke. Obviously, this was an affirmation of sacred power that surpassed in the sacrality of the Rex, the merely military ducal power that, yes, was, of course, endowed with a part of the imperium, but was mostly just made to serve, to fight, but not necessarily to rise to that higher standards of sacrality that somebody who could bid him, if that could claim. After all, the the crown had already been claimed by Henry, so this was not the case for Burkhard, if it was the case for the Bavarians, as we've seen, but there was also so much that these individual stamp duchies could claim at a point. Before enforcing acknowledgement in Bavaria, Henry turned his attention to Lotharingia. Right, this sort of eventually aborted chunk of the Carolingian Empire that would always remain a frontier area, a failed state in which many sort of dynasties proliferated at a point, but without ever getting like a comprehensive unity. There was, of course, what we know as the Duchy of Lorraine, that was in theory, and we made a video about this for the age, especially Frederick Barbarossa. We will have to also cover this for the regional series. It's a very complex history. But that's in fact not even the original Lotharingia as a whole. It's just a chunk of that. More important, admittedly, but... And Henry had connections with Lotharingia through his sister Oda, who was the widow at this point of the king Zwentibold, who was also the wife of Gerhard of the, what would remain at least the relatively minor, among the still higher noblemen of the empire, Lornay's house of the Matfriedings, right? Zwentibold is very interesting because he belonged to the Carolingian dynasty. He was the legitimate son of the Emperor Arnulf of Carinthia, that also, as you know, was from that side of southeastern Germany, so the broader Bavarian world, and that had basically succeeded to Charles the Third as a main ruler, had attempted also, in fact, to secure Italy for himself, etc. We'll talk about Arnulf of Carinthia. Now, in 895, Zwentibold's father had bestowed upon him the kingdom of Lotharingia, which he governed until his death. Now, the rise of Henry the Fowler coincided with a revolt against the rule of Charles the Simple in Lotharingia. We have seen this elsewhere. You know that Charles the Simple was also it's considered also as, he was a Carolingian himself, and he was the son of Louis the Stammer, that in turn was the eldest son of Emperor Charles the Bald and Ermentrude of Orléans. So there is all a history there. This is the age of Rollo, the settlement of the Normans in the Lower Sand, which was in fact an affront to St. Charles. We had, however, also allowed for this, after all, successful move on the longer run to stem essentially the Norse penetrations by settling some of them, just to having something to fight for in loco in that area. The revolt against Charles in Lotharingia had been led by Giselbert, not Giselbert, Giselbert, the son of Reginar Longneck, who had died in 915. Henry extended his support to Giselbert, so against Charles the Simple, and because of course the objective was destabilizing this frontier area, making it pass through these proxies, either from the side of East or West Francia. And Henry intervened himself in 900, either 20 or 21, against, in fact, Charles in Lotharingia. The campaign concluded with an armistice in summer of 921, because there was no way really to break through in either way, but you see here the initiative that Henry already takes against the Lotharingians. I made, again, some videos about these Lotharingian campaigns. If you're interested, you can go in Newtonian playlist and finding some of this. I shall create a playlist on Lotharingia as well, as we will delve more into its history. But you see how many intertwinements and how many noblemen, how many figures, like they had all, again, been raised in this hyperly imperial and Carolingian soaked ideology and sense of themselves, and they were really just not sort of backing off from their prerogatives, from their potential for overlordship at a regional level. Right? So yes, political fragmentation also caused by them, but still for the sake of recomposition, ultimately. Of course, many of them were just trying to carve their own space in order not to be wiped out, which was always an eventuality behind the corner. But all these people share like that grandeur of the imperial establishment, which is understood, especially the more east you go in that more original and strictly military way that they also by lifestyle in the more primitive Germany they had sort of more chances to prove themselves in. Later, in 921, Henry the Fowler compelled Arnulf of Bavaria to submit as well. This is another important achievement, given that at this point you have Franconia, Swabia, in part Lotharingia, and then Bavaria. It was also the bigger stem duchy. It's very articulated. At some point it encompassed also northeastern Italy. It went down to along the Danube, God knows up to which point, ideally, conceptually. Here there are issues, of course, with the Magyars. It's very, very complicated. There's just so much that we can say. However, once again, the king, Henry, utilized a pact of friendship to establish the future nature of the relationship with Arnulf that, as we've seen, had inspired to a royal title of sort. A royal title that Arnulf has to renounce anyway, however, becoming de facto Henry's vassal. It didn't change too much in a strictly territorial fashion, but morally speaking, it meant almost everything because, of course, that ambition was sort of now broken also in front of the local vassals that, yes, were now compelled to swear allegiance not to whichever ruler, of course, in Bavaria, the same Arnulf, but now also to this greater monarch, right, that superseded even their master. And given that the Saxons would, as we'll see now, not come that often to Bavaria in this generation again, this meant a lot of chaos, which is also the one that fuels further betrayal, right, and treachery as far as, for example, letting the Magyars pass through Germany, which normally happened through Bavaria, right? They said, okay, you want to go pillage the Rhineland or some other place further beyond, like in northeastern France or whatever, okay, just pass through here. We will not fight you, but please do not pillage us. Of course, much of this would backfire in many ways, and that's how eventually Otto I, the same Henry 933, were called like to really deliver this massive, as still, however, uncertain blows to the Hungars, and this because things had gone too far, right? And the same, it's like the entire system was suffering too much out of it. And Eastern Francia, again, if united, was of course the strongest one, as of course the defeat of Lechfeld would exemplify. Like the Magyars were properly abandoning any hope like to do anything against the West from that point onwards. They tried a bit against the Byzantines. That sort of doesn't work either, and so they decide to settle down, and they're amazed, they're stunned by these Germans that basically are their point of reference. The Magyars will Christianize the Roman way, and that's a great victory. This at the end of the Ottonian era, of course. It's very gradually as well. When in 925 Henry the Fowler ultimately succeeded in bringing Lotharingia under his dominion, he formed a similar pact with the aforementioned Gislabert, strengthening their bond by marrying his daughter Gerberga to Gislabert in 928. And it's not like Lotharingia will ever be fully as directly controlled, but it was just a massive proof of power assertion, especially against the Western Franks, so creating this sort of buffer state that would leave the Western boundaries, the Western provinces of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, sort of more peaceful and developing, including the same, Franconian and Saxony. Now, these friendship pacts with the dukes were an expression of Henry I's new policy and his intention to redefine kingship. From one side, it was a matter of recognizing these men their due, because they were important leaders in their kind. It was, especially during the 10th century, the creation probably of what we understand as the nobiliar class that at the time overlapped essentially with a knightly one, separated from the rest of the populace, that becomes ever more subservient and working to sustain this professional elite. But there is more, because Henry is still, yes, a primus inter pares, as still the German election would maintain that the king historically, but there was some greater rise to power and a new meaning of the same. When Henry rose to the Eastern Frankish kingship in 919, he was over 40 years old and possessed by that point, in fact, extensive experience in establishing his supremacy and defending his territories. When you look at the success of the great German kings, Otto I, Frederick Barbarossa, etc., you realize that these men's accomplishment, a bit like Alexander's, were due to the in great part due to the relentless preparation, background established by their respective fathers, that especially spent an excruciatingly large amount of time and energies in especially encastellating their own territories. This is what Henry the Fowler himself really does in Saxony, because rising to power in Saxony had already been by itself a bit of a challenge. There were also enemies in the north, in the east, outside, in fact, of probably the same Christian sphere. Again, these are pretty dark times, and the Saxons surely maintained that more sort of Dionysianly dark, Vodanic, instincts that see themselves as devoted to this unavoidable infernal initiation in order to rise to imperial dominance. And this potential springs out, overwhelming eventually the other German rulers. But it had been working also through the incredibly hard work of the entire local system, the peasantry, the clergy, the nobility. So many different castles were built. It is true that these areas will barely know a very strong fortification by the new standards that were appearing by this time, especially in central Italy, and spreading from there the rest of Europe. Let's say northeast Germany will see a systematic stone, for example, fortification only by the beginning of the 12th century. But it's not much a matter of technology, it's a matter of, in fact, it's the contrast, that the Ottonians managed to seize Italy, even though they are literally coming from basically one of the single most backwards and underdeveloped parts of the empire. Moral forces are greater than the material ones, even though they work together, but they're the ones that put resources in motion to begin with, So Henry the Fowler is really much the founder of this all, You can argue that there is much that his son's propaganda was able to historiographically develop with great success, and that you must respect in effectiveness to, in fact, sing the deeds of Lechfeld and the final destruction of the Magyars. But aside from, for example, the Bavarians, they're a bit like the unsung heroes of the situation that really took most of the brunt of the Magyar expansion and managed also to score some significant but less documented victories. I will make a video about this over the Magyars. They were the ones wearing them out the most on the southeastern frontier. Also, Henry the Fowler, especially the Battle of Riade, achieved this very substantial foundation, in that case, of their Novatio Imperium, like the imperial power in Eastern France. Henry the Fowler was thus evidently capable of recognizing realities and accounting for them, while pursuing his claims and objectives. The Liudolfings had established themselves as dukes without encountering any significant rivalries, suggesting a similar degree of consensus among the other noble lords. Locally, there was not a way to achieve this provincial power. At the Liudolfings, for the record, are the Ottonians. Initially, they were called after the earliest known member. At least, maybe they knew, of course, better their ancestry. But historiographically speaking, there is, again, this Count Liudolf, a Carolingian office bearer and count in the Duchy of Saxony from about 844, and is dead in 866. That's why I say an obscure Carolingian count, because we do not know the actual forefather to these. And in any case, we call the Ottonian dynasty the Liudolfing one, of course, because of the greater success, fame, and achievements obtained by, in fact, not even by Henry the Fowler, but by Otto I. The refounder of the Holy Roman Empire, that at least in, say, non-official terms, was really what he did, right? Tying Germany and Italy especially together for most of the rest of their history. Now, this consensus necessary to rise as a regional power may well have been a product of the somewhat archaic nature of the same Saxony we were pointing out before, right? There is even the warband predatory attitude that has never really been tamed in the Saxons, that in order to sort of survive have to loot somebody else's land, which is basically what gets them steamrolled by the Carolingians early on. Henry had, and so that they lived in a much more emergential situation, like a more difficult one, more pressured and stable one, so they have to be always on the move. Henry had also witnessed the failure of other pretendants, so that he had learned from this. This was the case, for example, for Conrad I of Germany, like a sort of very underrated figure, or at least almost forgotten one. This guy had struggled a lot with the control of other duchies. He ruled essentially, he was born in 881, and he was known as Conrad the Younger. He was king of East Francia from 911 to 918, so the predecessor to the same Henry. And Conrad had been the first king not belonging to the Carolingian dynasty, the first to be elected by the nobility, and the first to receive an anointment as well. So setting some very interesting standards, at least attentively setting them for the same kingdom of Germany, and most of this living on, in fact, in the kingdom's institutions. After the death of the young Louis the Child, Conrad had been selected as king by the leaders of Eastern Frankish stem duchies. He was ethnically Frankish. He had previously governed, in fact, the Duchy of Franconia since 906. And the background to this was somehow similar to Henry the Fowler's, because he had also been recognized by the Frankish and Saxon magnates as king, so receiving that green light by some of the most politically and internationally receptive parts of Germany, the Frankenland. I made a video about medieval Franconia about this. And in part this was due to, of course, the rivalries with Swabia, with Bavaria, so southern Germany, Germany on the right bank of the Danube, so again, culturally different at large from these other parts. And that's how Henry the Fowler, as Saxon Duke, had established his authority, by essentially recognizing the intermediate powers in the other provinces and duchies as well. Because some of these did not really have enough power at the moment to claim a royal power for themselves, and they had necessarily to be backed to sort of entrust themselves to a foreign duke of sort. Henry granted the dukes a vice-regal position and bound them to him through pacts of friendship, signed while simultaneously utilizing vassalic beneficiary bonds to subordinate them to him as a king. Henry also entered into friendship pacts with prominent noble families from his same Saxony, Lower Lotharingia, the Conradines, that were the same descendants of, probably in male line, but the aforementioned Conrad the First, and these Conradines would have, again, a very important role in the rest in following generations, right? They always were in between, like Saxony, Franconia. They also claimed at some point that they attempted to claim the throne of Germany for themselves again. Now, the new king established also a relationship of primus inter pares with the magnates, so having himself elected as primarily a military leader, as was the custom in Germany since Tacitus' times, simply continuing also in this fashion, because other rulers had done so before him, the relationship that he had with them from his time as duke, and that dual, like the idea of being a king mostly as a mandate was very much prominent in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, especially now that the Carolingian dynasty had vanished. This is likely one of the reasons why Henry refused, this is incredibly important in German history, to accept the unction, the anointment, which would have placed him above the magnates, and this is something that he likely understood that would have not been accepted in an ideological sense, because that was, as you know, something that started since Clovis and was already there into sort of the Germanic and the Jewish tradition. The anointed, as a Christian ruler there, conferred these leaders like some divine character, including some powers, as you know, to cure particular illnesses and more. But Henry's anecdotes include the ones of, him refusing eventually the imperial crown, because he said that after all, the one of the Eastern Frankish kingdom was enough of a honor for him, right? And that was a lot of realpolitik at work, and not that he would have despised imperial crown, just he did not have enough power at this point just to claim one, together with, the enactment of the Italian expedition, etc. But he successfully worked to establish the preconditions for his offspring to achieve that, except the anointing that was not really part. It would remain, as you know, in France, but Germany had sort of different path. Henry the Fowler's reign, however, was not like the ones of his predecessors. It really worked to define it in fact, more strictly German fashion. Henry, in fact, intended to emphasize a break from the continuity of kingship practiced by Conrad I, and especially the one of the Eastern Frankish Carolingians, highlighting a new, and in this sense specifically, of course, Liudolfing style of rule based in Saxony. That was more important for him at the moment, because if he achieved that, which he did, which was not to be given for granted, would have allowed, in fact, for the success of his house further. There were some advantages in this, especially his militaristic bias, in the sense that Saxony was threatened by sort of frontier peoples, but they were sort of more backwards and so not really in absolute terms being this greater issue, but let's say not being so appealing as a land. In fact, from the southern Germans were sort of being more passive towards this this Saxon power affirmation. This break in the Carolingian continuity was further evidenced by the fact that Henry did not adopt Conrad's royal chapel and chancery personnel, which was an important aspect in German kingship, because the court was itinerant, and in spite of various estates founded here and there, that was a capacity of the Eastern Frankish king. Of course, they controlled these key places that had also like a very symbolic relevance. So it's not like the imperial grandeur was put aside aspirationally. It was just like a dynastic shift that was actually highlighting how the same Liudolfings could be parallel to the Carolingians in greatness. And this is also what eventually succeeded in the Ottonian period. Henry the Fowler, in fact, gradually built up a new royal chapel of his own, which from the outset exhibited its unique, specifically Liudolfing characteristics. From a political and strategic standpoint, you can argue that one of the main achievements, at least, of Henry's rule was the recovery of Lotharingia. That on the longer run would, in fact, mark the definitive integration of this land within the Eastern Frankish kingdom, and thus, of course, like the Holy Roman Empire later on. This essentially showed in the international arena, regardless of the sort of difficulties that all these powers had sort of in recompacting on a national level, the sort of rising power of Germany from a demographic, economic point of view, because, of course, the country was the most backward, again, of all the post-Carolingian ones. Nevertheless, it had this particular type of power sharing that turned out to be more effective, and the one, in fact, that managed to put back at least great part of the empire together, right? Controlling Lotharingia allowed to basically have the upper hand in the broader landmass rule of Central Europe in relation to the Western Franks. It also allowed, in fact, further relations with the same rulers of Western Francia and Burgundy, the latter historically part of Lotharingia and the Italic kingdom. And even though, of course, these policies are not to be understood really in a deterministic or teleological sense. Even, say, the partition of the Carolingian Empire was in many ways like contingential, but obviously there was some broader logic. It was understood by these rulers. It was not sort of written down in any explicit sense, but it obviously was aiming there at essentially securing the longitudinal extension of the Eastern Frankish kingdom in order to secure also the Alpine control. And so the way to Rome and the possibility of playing bigger in the international arena, recovering the empire, because again, everybody's trying to do that if Rome is at hand, right? At this point, Rome is not at hand yet from Saxony, but in the next generation it will. Henry the Fowler neither sought a military solution nor allowed himself to become embroiled in factional infighting of sort. The sense, of course, is that the Germanic rulers had to show this wisdom by which it was a providential capacity, that is to say properly, the one of foretelling the future in the political action would eventually succeed. And so maintaining peace, maintaining a balance, and say seeking every possible support, especially using the Magyar invasions as a leverage, etc., was pivotal for the survivals of the Ottonian house in power. In fact, if you look at the rest of German history, you realize that regardless of this relatively more complicated, more difficult times, if anything, the Ottonians managed to remain in power for essentially 4 generations, and it is not to be, given for granted at all in this day and age. Henry the Fowler opted for a policy of compromise, reconciliation, while retaining the threat of military intervention as a last resort, but very well taking care of his, again, bloodthirsty Saxon professional armored horsemen. The bulk of this force was, in fact, we'll see now, displayed in actual military capacity many occasions. And again, that's what also he mostly did, because even if you appease, say, 3/4 of the issues, there's still 1/4 to address quite violently and intelligently, by the way. In November 921, Otto concluded the Treaty of Bonn, a pact of friendship with Charles the Simple that, as we've seen, had been the conclusion of the struggle over Lotharingia. The latter appeared as Rex Francorum Occidentalium, so the king of the Western Franks. It was probably the original terminology. And Henry, in fact, as the Rex Francorum Orientalium, the king of the Eastern Franks. And this stresses the idea of the people. Like, it's just, the Anglo-Saxon rulers would take the name of King of the English, meaning properly the English people, not of England, right? For a long time, this until after the Norman conquest, right? Neither before nor after this did Henry utilize, however, the Eastern Frankish royal title. His ambitions, of course, extended further. He was entirely prepared to break the pact with Charles, for example, and enter into another with the West Frankish anti-king. There was Robert of Francia. This was, the Robertian branch from which eventually the Capetians would stem from. We are only 2 years later, after the peace with Charles the Simple. And that, of course, depended also what was happening in Western Francia, which was at times pretty messed up. So you just have to exploit that anyway. The better for the stability of the Eastern Franks. These are very heavy quantities. I mean, if there is an issue that paralyzes the Western Frankish royal action, of course, like, you can't say, like, we finally have like lots of resources that do not have to be invested in the western border. We can use to consolidate internally, or to have some sort of surplus we can direct at some, as we'll see now, especially against the eastern frontier with the Slavs, which was a hell of a bloody mess. By 925, Lotharingia was de facto already incorporated into Henry's kingdom, just as it had once belonged to the kingdom of Louis the Younger, whose wife, Liutgard, was Henry's aunt himself. Louis the Younger is a very interesting figure. This is Louis II of Italy, right? So the one who co-ruled with his father Lothair until 855, and these men had embodied actually the very imperial legacy, because, as you know, the late Carolingians rule the empire from Italy, from Pavia, from the Lombard capital, right? And they were the emperors of the Carolingian Empire. Even though, again, the military, that the bulk of manpower was concentrated north of the Alps, it's not like it was always politically available. And actually, the Carolingians, I made a video about not those later Italic Carolingians, but a video about the Carolingians of Italy that really did a great job, all in all, especially Louis II. In any case, you understand again how far-ranging these relations really are, how imperial in nature they are. At an assembly in Worms in 926, Henry the Fowler concluded a friendship pact with Saint Rudolph II of Burgundy, which was also very involved in Italy at a point, and he contrasted, famously enough, Hugh of Provence. These were essentially the rulers of Upper Burgundy, right, in the Rhone Valley, and they were sort of more continentally oriented than, in fact, the rulers of Arles. We have seen how important this, when we talk about medieval Switzerland the other day, how in the videos they made about the kingdoms of Arles/Burgundy, how relevant it was to secure that area properly, like of the Lake Geneva, and this frontier was very difficult to reach. Also from Saxony, it was essentially between Burgundy and Alemannia/Suabia. That could go at these faraway leaders' mutual advantage when they couldn't simply properly even interfere with one another more than much. In this case, the Burgundian ruler acknowledged Henry's overlordship, offered himself along with the Holy Lands, right? And in handing this over to Henry, also relinquishing his claims to the rule in the Kingdom of Italy, right? The Italic noblemen at some point had called the same Rudolf to counter. I made an entire video about the resistance to Hugh of Tuscany, Hugh of Provence. That was also, in fact, a rival to Rudolf II. These were all the hostilities. Again, you can check out the videos about the Kingdom of Burgundy, but this whole thing is all propedeutic, as we just observed, to obtaining some sort of broader hegemony that will eventually allow the Ottonians to launch their own Italic expedition and get the imperial title for themselves and more, right? Plus this thing of the Spear of Longinus is, of course, like very relevant, because it is a massive recognition of already imperial grandeur, regardless of the unachieved title yet, right? Henry de Fowler's lance was credited for winning the Battle of Riade, right? And this seemed, in fact, that the major imperial accomplishment that would, a bit like the Battle of Lech, that would eventually allow Otto for sort of sweeping the way out of all the Magyars and going to Italy without problems, right? This is very important. And it had already began with this Burgundian reassurances. Again, this was more like a provincial ruler, so he did not really have a capacity to hegemonize Italy by itself. He could just, again, float over this local Italic nobility. Not extremely differently from how the same Otto I will do, because, again, he had a lot of manpower, international prestige, more than his father by this point, needless to say. But it's not like, again, he could control even like the entirety of Germany, and barely in the sense. He was mostly floating over this wider area of Europe that was requiring some sort of single ruler after the Carolingian collapse to put things back in order together and sort of stabilize the system. This is what really the Ottonians managed to do in many ways, and it's really an extraordinary accomplishment considering what had happened. There is even a meeting of the three kings, that is Henry I, Radulf of West Francia, we'll look at him in another video, and Rudolf of Burgundy at Ivoire in 935. This, of course, demonstrates the prominence that Henry had achieved among the kings of the same Carolingian successor states. It was like saying, here we meet in this, center of this was in Belgium, right? It was part of Lotharingia, so it had an important meaning, because it was a bit like the, as we've seen, partially disputed center of the empire that nobody fully controlled, but Henry had now properly accomplished the hegemony on. So this is particularly powerful in an international sense, in a time in which you think that everybody was also simply minding their own business, right? Rudolf of France, by the way, is the son of Robert the First, right? These had been the counts of Poitiers and of Paris, like Marquis of Neustria and Orléans. And so they are really the finest successors altogether to Carolingian hegemony, authority, and legacy. The other main feature of Henry the Fowler's rule was, of course, the defense against the Magyar invaders and the efforts especially made to bring the Elbe Slavs under his control. Because we've seen it in different videos, the problem with the Magyars was not just the fact that they were particularly good raiders, intruders, and looters, right? Very well organized, were very smart, very careful, not entangling themselves in sort of major clashes, etc., and coming back to the Hungarian plain loaded, in fact, in riches from all the post-Carolingian kingdoms. It was the fact that they could make leverage on the Western Slavs that had never really been happy of anyone that had ever ruled in the Pannonian Basin, but they had sort of set up and now could even exploit, especially the lower on the Elbe, so more distant from the Magyars and sort of closer to Saxon itself, to launch raids on their own into the eastern part of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom. At this point in history, really, Bavaria, Thuringia, Saxony do risk to be, say, decisively crippled and destabilized as districts of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom by these Magyaroslav raids. And so I made a mini-series last year's summer about these Ottonian campaigns on the Elbe. We looked a bit at everything, mostly from a strategical, operational, tactical point of view. But this video sort of tells you a bit about the political and also strategic background from there, really. Clausewitzianly, right, taking from the military outcome, like eventually the political decisions. Even before his rise to kingship, Henry had fought against the Daleminzi. These were some of the Western Slavic tribes along the middle Elbe. There was a bit like, as you know, the boundary between the Germanic and the Slavic world, right? In Charlemagne's times, these Western Slavs were allied with the Franks to crush the Saxons. They naturally were stronger than the Slavs, but now Charlemagne gave the latter a chance, let's say. But when Saxony was conquered and fully integrated into the Frankish Empire, of course, it becomes the next frontier, and that's why also the Ottonians are so effective, so militarized, right? The Liudolfings developed all this military clientele, because there was always some rowdy Slav to beat, and of course, like the Saxons were always up to a fight. They weren't even overwhelmingly and radically different peoples, telling the truth, but indeed, like, the difference between the Franks and the Saxons was smaller. And it was somehow consistent in one between the Saxons and the Western Slavs. In any case, here, Ottonian steel is something, right? And these are probably some of the most underratedly traumatic frontiers, like, in the entire history of mankind. I mean, what here the Germans and the Slavs exchange between one another, regardless, of course, of the mixed picture. We've seen it in the video about the Ottonian army organization, where Slavic mercenaries, even Vikings, used by both contingents, telling the truth. And of course, there is a broader purpose. You know how it would end historically on the long run. Like, the Bohemians are basically brought into the Holy Roman Empire, right? So duchy as a kingdom, eventually. The Poles, not, but the Poles here are still like the Polani, the original Polani tribe that has been expanding at the expense also of this surrounding Slavic peoples. And so it's somehow distant. And so there are this part of these Slavic forces that basically lived in what is roughly today's northeastern Germany that get in fact conquered by the Germans, Germanized and part massacred, deported, etc., as part of the broader Ostsiedlung that, of course, the Liudolfings engage in. And there is all a story there with Eastern marks, and we will see in the original series. In any case, the Elbe was such an important communication route also for trade. The Baltic was not just Viking pirates wanting to kill every Christian. It was some wealth, some traffics, even of the same Slavs. I mean, the Ottonians would take lots of this as prisoners of war, as slaves. They would sell them to the Vikings. It also indulged into this, cute activities. It was really normal, especially like in northeastern Europe. Slavery continues up to basically the longest in any part of the country, unless we're talking of the continent, unless we're talking about this Christian-Islamic clash there. In any case, you see there that the Daleminzi back in the day had, this before Henry rose to the throne, had already called upon the Magyars for assistance. So there is always this interesting dynamic. The Magyars brought sort of the equestrian step, punching force, and the Slavs were, if not the auxiliaries, but of course mostly the foot component, because they did have cavalry, but they had much less surplus than these other peoples, at least in the way they were structured, and they thus were mostly just phalanxes of infantry men. The Ottonians would develop properly phalanxes of cavalry against the Magyars, especially as creating shield walls against these steppes arrows that, of course, the Magyars were characteristic for. But again, this is not a military history video. We'll come back on this. Just know I've made a lot about it. There is the video about Slavic warfare from the Strategicon and Leo the Wise, Tactica. Made so many. Again, easily search for Slavic warfare, Ottonian warfare as well, etc. The Magyars launched their initial attack on Saxony as early as 906, exactly through the territory of the Daleminzi. Therefore, the defense against the Magyars and the control of the neighboring areas inhabited by the Elbe Slavs were closely intertwined. By paying a substantial tribute, Henry, especially after he had become a king, was able to secure a 9-year truce from the Magyars, which was something. It was a way. You find sometimes on YouTube these videos, the Byzantine Empire fell because it paid too much tribute. No, it did not fall because of that, right? And you're not better at politics than a Byzantine emperor. That I have my issues with the Byzantines, but it's not like I don't respect them, or I don't respect intelligence. And so let's please not offend it. In 927, Duke Arnulf, so it would be like the king from Bavaria, also renewed a truce that had first been established in 918, because again, especially the Bavarians were quite active. We said it before, they were the most exposed to the Magyars and the Slavs to the Magyars and the Slavs, yes, and they were also the ones who had sort of been guiding more the process of evangelization of the Western Slavs. The ones in the north, say at the same latitude of Saxony, understood much sort of better the language of swords in their teeth. But let's say that there was a common issue, right, that the Bavarians and the Saxons were sharing. The Thuringians were just so historically they had been crushed by the Saxons and the Franks at some point. The former especially had been also the Franks, but they had been colonizing from Saxony, the northern part, so that Thuringia will emerge as a stem Dutch historically, bit more like a sort of a failed state compared to these other neighboring ones. I made a video about medieval Thuringia, and also probably about the Thuringi since antiquity, so that you can appreciate the continuity as well. The Saxons were stronger; they had the upper hand. There was, because of this tributes for a while, there was an end to the Magyar raids in Saxony and Franconia, starting 926 and from 927 in Bavaria, Suabia, and Lotharingia. This gave time to Henry to foster again those forces that would eventually deliver the heaviest blows, like Riade in 933. That was really like a big deal, as important perhaps as the Lech, but again, Otto had a much better propaganda than his father, right, to publicize his military accomplishments that are, of course, like very big in nature, no doubt whatsoever. This is interesting because the Magyars, as you know, at this point really reach everywhere. They go as far as southern Italy, as northern Spain. They ravage really like around northeastern France, the Rhineland, and mostly they hit, however, Germany proper. Like that's the single most hit part. And they're really devastating. There is probably a very well documented chronology about the pain and suffering that they inflicted on this land that at some point had enough of it. At an assembly held by Henry with his magnates in Worms, the aforementioned one in 926, defensive measures were determined as well. And that's also how, like, the 10th century is a great moment of encastellation. You can argue that sort of the northern part of the former empire had been sort of more emergentially encastellating than other parts of the empire, where sort of encastellation is this is valid but everywhere later. Like it's mostly like a post-invasion phenomenon, because at least the emergential fortresses that were erected to stem these raids were not as relevant as the ones that the local rulers would build to sort of establish some sort of permanent dominion, right? You would have to block these guys on the passes, whereas if you really wanted to control the entire land, you have to build these fortresses in the mid of an open plain. Like, of course, you could have both, but the point is that also archaeologically speaking, the emergential ones on, say, the passes did not survive as much as the ones in the lowlands. Also, these raids were frequent on an original level. They were quite far-reaching and like over quite extensive areas, but they weren't really coming like every single year. So there were still local dynamics that were sort of worthier of the local attention. We've just seen it. Like this German policy does not fundamentally get, let's say, redrawn at the bone just by the Magyars. Of course, these are one of the most important factors, but there is probably like a German power base that went realizing that forces must be joined against invaders because everybody's losing. Otherwise, like, rather than throwing them at one another for their petty rivalries, like they overwhelm them completely. But these defensive measures are interesting. They included the enlargement of existing fortifications, the establishment of new ones throughout the kingdom. If anything, there is a control on these prerogatives that were mostly public. As you know, you couldn't simply create a fortress out of nowhere. Naturally, in post-Carolingian times, this is essentially what is happening literally everywhere. But still, like, kings, like in this case, want to have their saying to it. They want to, of course, allow also for all those who have already built these possessions to receive some recognition, which entails in turn the recognition of the same king. So this is also beyond personal. It's about the institution. It's about how much power you can orientatively concentrate in this way, and still sort of attentively uniform some better defense against this barbarians. Now, in Saxony, which still retained military obligations that reflected a relatively archaic period, some free peasant warriors, the so-called agrarii milites, so literally like the agrarian knights, were entrusted with both the construction of the fortifications and their subsequent garrisoning. I talked about the agrarii milites in the video about the Ottonian army organization, and it's something very interesting. It has to do with the gradual affirmation of what would become also the ministerialis class, but looking at sort of different lords who had already been building fortifications that now also could extend to like some militia system that revolved around upkeeping these fortifications, sometimes even erecting new ones, and using this youth from the countryside to sort of garrison force that could work also some sort of social promotion. Generally speaking, if you were to garrison one castle in that sense, especially as a less affluent milas, you were at times exempted also from the longer military expeditions. There were mercenaries roaming around, some being quite disruptive, and so just the same Ottonians give them some castle where to stay, and especially in the Elbe frontier, that remember, like probably the Magdeburg, Quedlinburg, that the centers of Ottonian powers are really there, right? And so literally from the other side, which is the enemy, so that shows you how projected the Ottonians were, especially towards the eastern frontier. Because it was their home. It was being threatened just next door. Henry also took steps to increase the number of armored horsemen across the kingdom, but especially within Saxony, which was, of course, much more under his direct control, effectively innovating, like updating the Saxon forces that had remained a bit, as we've seen, a bit more brutal, a bit more infantry-based, like in the earlier Germanic period, and now really fully, developing the professional armored mounted elite. The new troops were tested, and we've seen it again in dedicated videos in these campaigns from 928 to 934 against the Elbe Slavs. It's easy because you can rise up the river also with boats, facilitating the supply, etc. The Thuringians, the Bavarians, others have to, of course, to cooperate in this. And we see that the milites that could often dismount still, regardless of the fact that they were normally going at war, of course mounted, they played a significant role, right? At this point, especially against the Slavs, you understand that this will be proven also against the Magyars, but I mean, here Western cavalry is really becoming a thing, right? Carolingian times had seen the molding of this, and they were already quite powerful. But in Ottonian times, you have like the 10th century, the military class, all across all post-Carolingian Europe, basically identifying by status, by skill, by this technical capacities, horsemanship, etc., as literally as an estate on its own. And also, of course, in other countries, there is, if anything, an imitation, like some sort of osmotic influence from the same bulk, like continental Europe, that is really the one that informs all the surroundings here. The territories of the Slavic peoples, as far as the Oder, were largely subjected to a still imperfect overlordship and tributary dependence. We've seen it especially in the videos about the Eastern Marks, that took so much time to take off like as proper states, in parallel with the aforementioned rhythms of encapsulation. It's not before the early 12th century that you have a sort of neatly outlined sort of feudal border between the respective areas, also with Poland, with Bohemia, because simply these places had too scarce surplus. So yes, the local military was not as competitive, challenging, especially in open field, right? Western cavalry would often steamroll them. It was not literally that easy. It was always a matter of combined arms, infantry, missile, even catapults, etc. were particularly important. But the Slavs were especially known historically as, fanatic defenders, and in this sense, you could ravage their territories, you could destroy different places, but they would always come back because they were just habituated to a lower quality of life, and they could endure sacrifices that already for the Germans were a bit too much, right? And it's not like the Germans were provided with a particularly pronounced sensitivity towards humanity in general. So especially against the Slavs, they were understood as sort of subhumans in that regard. And believe me, like certain things that we witnessed in the 20th century were very deeply ingrained from millennia. It was not like somebody woke up one day and decided that. This frontier is again of a level of brutality that it's perhaps just like the Baltic frontier is something else. It's something more traumatic. Like the Mongol invasion as well, but let's say these ones come second because they are literally terrifying. Not even the Celtic fringe is that horrifying, in spite of the efficient English Anglo-Norman brutality against the Celts. Now, so over time, like the policy was mostly conquering an avampost or either destroying that or founding a new one in more advantageous positions, leaving some militants there, and sometimes these guys making a horrifying end. I mean, some Baltic peoples at a point cooked Teutonic knights into their armor alive, so you have this other very tender-hearted predisposition from the other side. But important was still to sort of this was a tit-for-tat game. This is what the Saxons had learned the art way also with the Franks themselves. They were so good at right now on this frontier, asserting their own supremacy with all means, coming back and having more means. That's what the Ostsiedlung eventually pushes, like Germany, literally as physically far beyond the east. Also because there is literally no historical boundary in Germany in the east. Like it's completely open. It's just like a matter of personal opinion to an extent where Germany ends. Now, in 929, Henry compelled the Duke Wenceslas of Bohemia to submit. The Czechs had established this so they were closer to civilization. So they were the ones who early on sort of created this more neatly compact, well enucleated, also thanks to geography a bit, a territory that, however, could not do too much. It's a sort of provincial reality on its own. We talked about this early Bohemian history. Like the Poles are much more powerful, but they sort of have much greater issues of keeping that enormous set of tribes they had conquered early on under the Piasts together. Here you have, of course, already the Przemyslids. In the territory of the Dalemins instead, there were again another people. This would disappear historically, like the Obodrites, others who covered them at some point, but they were sort of absorbed by the Germans, if not in some cases probably wiped out, at least in a consistently Demic sense. They became the subjects of these German lords in quite painful fashion. In this territory, Henry established a center for his lordship in the fortification of Meissen. I made a video about the mark of Meissen, and we've seen exactly in these locations that dynamic of, again, tit for tat, creating new centers. This was one of the new centers, the new mark created exactly at the time of Henry the Fowler, which is quite interesting. Now, among the commanders, we find types like the Count Siegfried in Merseburg. There was also on the side in the Margraves Bernard and Dithmar on the lower Elbe as well. In 929, I discussed this, the Germans defeat a Slavic army that had advanced across the Elbe at Lenzen. This had been essentially an intrusion into Saxony, which had been rendered possible by other events that were going on in Europe, and the Saxons, of course, now go like the most iron-fisted possible way ever, because they win in a clamorous way. Armored cavalry plays a crucial role. This is a major victory scored on these peoples that basically secures like the entire provincial dimension there. Really a significant victory for the Saxons. It's raw, right? It's raw. By 932, Henry felt strong enough to risk open clash with the Magyars. Right? These other Slavs had mostly attacked, a bit like the Saxons did with the Franks, until they got burned. Because they were desperate, they didn't have resources. They understood that if they didn't capitalize on a single moment of weakness of the Saxons, they were done for. But they weren't this threatening thing. They could, again, disturb them, they could cause them damage, they had to be stopped, and they were. The Magyars were something else, because the Magyars were like the steppes overlords, which, again, we shouldn't overly incense. I mean, people tend always to overly exaggerate Viking, Magyar, and Saracen power for some reason, when the entire story points, like in this case, at the fact that, of course, the post-Carolingian kingdoms were all stronger than them. But of course, it's not like it was to be given for granted at the time that, especially this people of nomadic, semi-nomadic, now mostly horse archers, could be, say, obliged to fight in open field, and therefore, yes, you could fundamentally reinforce the Eastern Frankish kingdom in many ways, but it still would have been, it would have taken longer, because the Magyars could have not been decisively crushed in a major open field engagement. We will talk at some point about the Battle of Riade. By 932, Henry the Fowler's military machine was really mature to take on the Magyars out there in the open. That's the reason why Henry actually cancels the tribute payments versed to the Hungars. And so when the Magyars appeared in Saxony in 933, because they said, "What did you do? We'll leave off of that." This was really an affront for them. They were defeated by an army predominantly composed of heavily armored cavalry, at least apparently so, in a very interesting. This was a double-day battle. There were lots of issues with how, the entire tactics and the sort of the strategy of it all. It's a very interesting battle, but this points to the effective superiority of the Frankish system over the Magyars in this case. And so this was also a great test of the Eastern Frankish loyalty to Henry as a ruler, because there were levies drawn from all the peoples of the realm. So imagine that, because that's also how certain countries' national identity step by step is built. Like the fact that you can convince all these different provinces to feel a common sentiment, in this case of hatred towards this savage foreigners that had been looting and squeezing them for such a long time. Like it's something marking, like a deep mythological identity, which is the one that effectively Henry the Fowler collects, and that also his son Otto I will do. It's more or less in the same ways. Again, Lech is that more complex battle, but Riade is also fascinating. In the following, because the Magyars were tendentially avoiding open confrontation, they knew that their cavalry was not as good in hand-to-hand combat as the Eastern Frankish one, quite approximately, because they had their good one, but tendentially they could field less in proportion. They had more horse archers at Semili. So Riade was really a massive success for Henry, really the one that shows the Magyars that the party is not over, but they will have to be much more careful and also invest many more resources to enter Germany once again. They will keep doing that until 955. That's literally the end of it all, from a day to another. The Saxon army triumphs also over a Danish petty king on the northern frontier. The Germans did have their fair share of Viking nightmarish experiences. A bit less, because objectively there was less to sack in there, but the Vikings were a problem for the Teutonians as well. Were just like the most exposed in the north. To that, at least in a more direct, like across the border sense, the Vikings privileged somehow the great riverways, and the Elbe was a bit too savage, but the Rhine wasn't, right? So this string of victories over both invaders, the Magyars and the Norsemen, definitely secured the first Saxon king a reputation that extended well beyond the borders of his kingdom. Henry the Fowler, deserved the recognition of an imperial capacity, and is one of the great heroes, of course, in the history of the German kingdom. Henry's approach to kingship reflected both his personal ambitions and the transformations that had taken place within the system of the kingdom. The Saxon king abstained from entering Bavaria and Swabia following the submission of their dukes. Not only they were distant from Saxony in so many ways that it's not just as the crow flies. It's literally, again, all these forests, all these logistical problems to get there, the political machinations to even just move their troops there, and especially like even if the Saxons had done it again, of course the locals would have felt such monarchic presence as too oppressive. So it was effectively also sort of a great display of power. Like, I beat your leader, and so you realize who's really in charge here, and don't try it again. It was a way to undermine, of course, the local leadership in some ways, or allowing other noblemen that would rise in the aftermath of the local dukes defeat. From the Saxon side, of course, there were parties here into the respective ducal retinues, and so that's something, if anything, we will look at in another video better. The appointment of Hermann, a member of the Conradine family, as Duke of Swabia in 926 did not alter the situation. None of these duchies had really achieved what Saxony had, so it was useless to just even provoke another Saxon intervention, especially considering that they were so distant. So let's exploit that, right? Swabia and Bavaria were, dealing with their own problems, especially the Bavarians with the Magyars, and the Swabians mostly because of their sort of lesser power in comparison to these ones. So the more distant the Saxons were, the better. The central political area of the former Carolingian kingdom, encompassing the regions around the Rhine and Main rivers, so we're talking the Carolingian kingdom of Eastern Francia was now supplemented by East Saxony and Thuringia, which were reinforced by all those expeditions along the Elbe and the Saxon kingship. This served for Henry as a new base domain. Because again, yes, the Rhine and the Main basins were sort of, the more fruitful ones in absolute wealth, if we exceptuate some parts of the Danube that, as we've seen, were sort of not much at hand. But historically, these areas were also a bit more fragmented, perhaps a bit for the same reason, like in the Western Frankish kingdom also was, but also with a bit more of a German issue connected with it, regardless of the surplus availability. If anything, as you know, yes, Franconia would come back to be like the power of Germany after Saxony, but it wouldn't also remain there for long. It was not such a... Say, all these duchies are not even that particularly well outlined, especially after the Ottonian period. There is so much power sharing with Saxony. Like, for example, all the Salians descended themselves from the Saxon nobility, so it's more at that point trying to control the entirety of the kingdom by touring on these various centers in various places, just orientatively gravitating more around one duchy or another. It was important to strengthen, to give more breadth of power property to the Saxon base, the one that the Liudolfings directly control. We've seen it before, also just extending in the west and in the east more, right, to allow more controls in southern Germany and eventually also in Italy on the longer run. Needless to say, the Ostsiedlung was going in parallel with this, like, the more you colonized and fortified and settled and garrisoned in the east, the more say direct consequences you could achieve in this overall expansion. Furthermore, the territory between the Lower Rhine and the Meuse centered on Aachen, the old Carolingian capital, probably the Rome of the North, all built in stone, like, so a major deal that, however, really wouldn't bring, also in this case, the city to be particular relevance in the rest of the Middle Ages, if not as a see the Roman crowning, not much of the power on its own. Acquired, however, new significance as a region for exercising kingship because it's so close to Saxony, to an extent, at least. There is no... It's in the north, and there is no major power in between. And so, given that the entire Lotharingian area as well is so much now under the Eastern Frankish hegemony, like, the Ottonians tend to appropriate themselves of the symbolism, of the centrality of the place. This had once been probably a core domain of the Carolingian Empire, right? Had never really held central importance within the Carolingian system of the former Frankish kingdom, but even though, as we said before, the Liudolfings wanted to say that they were essentially yet another imperial, pretty ranked house, differently from the Carolingians, Aachen was unavoidably like a legacy that the Saxon house wanted to keep also to acquire for his own. So it makes a lot of sense, naturally. A lot more could be said in this direction. Again, it's mostly about the itinerant nature of German power. At this point, indeed, it's much restrained to this sort of ducal provincialism, but it's expanding, and it's unavoidably doing so. And you want to appreciate, in fact, how much even Henry the Fowler managed to operate across the land without, of course, like any significant impediment when well supplied, having a proper strategy and political drive. Now, when we analyze the wall, you realize that Henry's Eastern Frankish kingdom appears less as a continuation of the Francia Orientalis, so the eastern Frankish kingdom with its core regions around the Rhine-Main confluence in Bavaria, linked by a transit region that included Suabian East Franconia, and more as a revival of the political constellation established by Charlemagne. We explained why. Like, essentially, the Western power that had managed to hegemonize and sort of direct the same Eastern Frankish kingdom that was a land of conquest. Essentially, the Franks accomplished what the Romans had just started, like the conquest of Germany. Like this had already been going on relentlessly through Merovingian times, especially in Franconia, etc. But you realize that the rise of Saxony sort of evaluates the previous importance, especially of Bavaria, as the center of Germany. This sort of happens historically, right? In Germany, especially because you have all these more or less equivalent centers that really acquire ever more importance depending on some contingental factors. You have first, essentially, Bavaria. That's where the Carolingians rule from. Then you have the Teutonians in Saxony. Then you have the Salians in Franconia. Then you have the Swabians, the Hohenstaufen in Swabia. Then you have the Habsburgs in Austria. Then you have the Luxembourgs in Bohemia. Like, you have all these very interesting shifts that are never like quite always the same. Like, Saxony has, as you know, a moment of very important coming back. Like, it, especially in the 12th century, was not even that far away, of course, from Ottonian times. And then in the later Middle Ages, we talked about its partitions, its issues. Actually, yes, Saxony would survive as, where and another, but still through many issues and non-obvious dynamics that depend all on so many intricate factors, especially the more you go ahead into German history chronologically, the more messy, but still sort of momentous they become. So this is a very important step further, because if you look at the beginning of this video and you think about that Teutonic feeling, objectively, even though the ancient Teutonics came from the southern Jutland, hey, Saxony is basically there. Actually, certain parts of Saxony proper went beyond even the north of the Alp estuary. We were looking at it in the video about Schleswig-Holstein that we'll have to complete at some point. So it's as if, like, the affirmation of the House of Saxony in this period put into crisis the older axis of expansion and consolidation. So essentially what had been the Roman limes that the St. Carolingians foster, like, again, Bavaria is richer, the Rhine, the Main areas are very developed indeed. At this point instead, it's, again, the poorest part of it all that takes over. And so puts also things a bit more in crisis from an apparently peripheral area the same Carolingians had snubbed, and that instead now, thanks to the leadership factor also of the Liudolfings, manages to score such a great result. So you see how non-obvious politics relates, or at least how it is when you start considering the moral forces and not some sort of pre-rest, so deterministic dimension. So in this renewed arrangement, the core regions were those surrounding the lower Rhine and Meuse, admittedly, the Rhine and Main still, and Saxony. These were sort of again, Saxony itself prefers like the western, southwestern direction, because it makes more sense. That's why Franconia is twinned with Saxony at this point. There are some transit regions that, as we've seen before, like the Bavarians in Carolingian times tried, I explained it in the video about the Lieder German, to link up with Gaul, even subulating some revolts, like the ones of the Aquitanians against the Western Franks, passing through Swabia and having this interesting sort of north of the Danube approach towards especially eastern Franconia. These were areas that like a very interesting, together with Thuringia, there had been even some sort of Slavic presence back in the day there, and still today, Bavaria stretches further north into what is historical Franconia and the modern land. It's all part of those legacies in many ways. Now, the joint parts of the main lands Germanized by the Ottonians become, in the age of Henry the Fowler, Westphalia. That is still part of Saxony, so that is, of course, the westernmost part, and you see here already some sort of vassalitic beneficiary that is essentially feudal dynamic that surpasses the stem Dutch dichotomy, because it's the elites now that rule. It's not much like a matter of people anymore. Hesse and East Franconia. But really, it's all towards the southwest compared to Saxon. Now, it was through Henry the Fowler's practices and the political reorganization during his reign that essentially the Ottonian kingdom of Francia et Saxonia was established. This was not random, because France was so important conceptually in the imperial grandeur and legacy of the kingdom. Basically, just the Romanity of the empire would supersede it under Otto I, Otto II, Otto III. Like, probably the idea that these were not even Saxons anymore, they were Romans in an ethnic sense, like metaphysically ethnic sense. But that's, of course, for another video. I already discussed it here and there, that. There is a beautiful set of diplomata issued by Otto I in 936 and 938. So just in his first steps after his father's rule, which acknowledged the provinces represented by his kingship, Francia et Saxonia, in Latin, which of course referred to Franconia and Saxony. But it's also like a broader symbol of literally the Carolingian legacy and this newly, in fact, surpassing, transfiguring Ottonian power that had managed to at least reach the same level of Charlemagne. And not yet, because at least in 936, 938, Otto I was yet to become Otto the Great. But you understand that if he became that, it's because there was this precondition, and so here the times were essentially just maturing for that direction to be fully taken and that achievement to be fully accomplished. So it's really a big deal in European history, and it's really important to look at it in this perspective, because, like, I don't know, when's the last time you've listened, to an in-depth video about, Ottonian history in these terms? Well, YouTube has its ways of creating sort of engaging content, entertaining one. I'm not exactly here for, say, the fun aspect, let's say, but how many videos did we make about the Ottonians? Probably a lot, but not as many as I would have liked. Let me check. Because there is Ottonian Germany only, and I made one about the Ottonian. This is what, in fact, one about only 15. It's too few. It's too few, especially like, yeah, we must make more. But this year we already made a couple, so it is something, right? All these topics are an evergreen, especially if you are very much sort of into my range, let's say, of how it should really be. In here, there is a lot of stuff that we'll have to fix anyway, also with the plate as well. There are 4 more. How is it possible? Yeah, maybe I understand how. Depends how I categorize the videos in various playlists. Let's. I hope like this video in particular, like as you know, I've been having a pretty consistent spike in views recently, and I hope this content will just keep it up, because it's I understand that people like this stuff, like the Teutonians are like a hot topic when you properly harness it. And so let's go on step by step. Remember that everything I do, it's never anecdotal, right? That I can personally die, but it's not like I could be stopped from making this videos in general. So it's never like you should fear that I will not take that extra step of in-depth historical analysis for each and every topic possible available. So it takes a while because we cover really a lot of stuff in general, but this content is meant just to be always the next step towards something bigger, a bigger deal, right? Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.